Thank you, Evelyn. Appreciate the kind words. Well, it's my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Secretary of State for the state of Mississippi, Michael Watson. And I want to thank him up front. I know how busy he is and how much work his position demands. Let me tell you a little bit about the Secretary, Michael. Mr. Watson Secretary Michael Watson is the husband to Lauren and the dad to three beautiful girls, Gracie Pierce, Annie, and Cora Elizabeth. Born and raised in Pascagoula, Secretary Watson is a graduate of Pascagoula High School, the University of Mississippi, and the University of Mississippi School of Law. His father was a pipe fitter and a current minister. His mom was a bank teller and executive assistant. He served 12 years as a strong conservative in the state Senate and is now Mississippi's 36th Secretary of State. And again, just a reminder to please put your questions in the chat and I'll go through them, and we'll have a question and answer session after the Secretary is done speaking. And without further ado, let me hand it over to Secretary Watson. Welcome, Secretary.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. I assume, is everybody here a member of the organization, or do we know? I know there are a couple of folks.
It is a community invitation, so there may be people here from our community, but primarily it'll probably be by our members.
Got it. Good deal. Well, clearly always an important topic. Elections are the bedrock of our country. As I tell everybody all the time, you can talk about policy all you want to, and policy is important, but if you don't have free, fair, safe, and secure elections, policy becomes secondary to that. So elections are very important. As y'all have noticed, it's a topic of conversation across the country. Following the 2020 election, really elevated the office of Secretary of State. The issues that we deal with elections, as you probably very well know, Mississippi is a bottom-up state. Clearly, our clerks and our commissioners, elections commissioners, do a phenomenal job here in our state. We house SIMS, which is a statewide election management system here in our office. So just kind of give you some background on how elections run here. And it's very important for us to have the communication, open lines of communication with our clerks and our commissioners, because they are the ones who are the feet on the ground in running the elections, the election process at the local level here in our state. So we oversee, again, the statewide election management system, but work hand in hand with them as they run elections, advising them, being in the precincts, making sure that people know we don't just talk about the integrity of the system. We're actually in the precincts, making sure that folks know we want to obviously make sure the law is being followed in the precinct. So it's a busy time here. We have congressional elections this year. And so that's a big piece of what we do. Again, making sure that people are aware of the elections process, the elections cycle, the dates for the election. So I've gotten a couple of folks on the line here with me. I guess you say line on the Zoom here with me, and they will be active in the chat box. So if you have questions while I'm talking and they want to respond, Kyle runs our elections division. Does a phenomenal job for our office. A very intelligent young man and very driven to do what's right and do what's good for Mississippi. So honored to have him. And then most of you met before. Where did she go? Kendra is on here as well. Kendra James, my comms director. She does a great job of outreach. And one of the things that we've found very important and very helpful is going into our communities. And if it's a Rotary Club or if it's your group or whomever invites us, we go in and we talk about elections. Why is it important? Understand the process, starting from voter registration all the way to the election day. So what does it look like? And the more people know, the better informed they are. I think it is better for the elections process here in our state. So specifically on your topic, I think it's a very important one. You've seen a national narrative and a national conversation about election officials being under attack. And I've got friends on both sides of the aisle, R's and D's, at the local level, at the state level, you name it. We all have conversations from time to time about what they're seeing in their states. And one of the ones I remember the most after 2020, they got really heated, was in Michigan. And then there were several others, but I know that Jocelyn had to have protection at her house around the clock for quite some time. So it is an important topic, an important issue. We work with the Department of Justice. They set up a task force to look specifically at this. And we've had meetings with them to talk through, what are we seeing here? What are you seeing in other states? And that's one of the important things that we have seen is the conversations that we're having with other states. It's so important because what's happening in Michigan or New York or Arizona or Florida or anywhere else in the country could quite possibly be happening in Mississippi as well. So having those conversations of making sure that we're all on the same page, seeing what we're seeing and sharing that information is very important to us. I do think it's very important on this conversation. We can't overlook some of the reasons I think that you're seeing this escalation. Clearly, some individuals in elective office have made statements that rile people up, and I get that. But we also need to look at did anything happen in 2020? And let me tell you specifically about Mississippi. I believe with all my heart we had a great election in 2020. I believe that the clerks and the commissioners did a phenomenal job. Our poll workers, poll managers did a wonderful job on election day. And think about this. One of the things I love to remind people is the turnout that we had in Mississippi. In this national narrative about how hard it is to vote in Mississippi. Well, if that's the case, let's look at our turnout numbers. And you can't overlook that we had COVID in the picture as well. So even with COVID, that contentious election that we still had a phenomenal turnout here in Mississippi. I'm very proud of the job that we did reaching out to communities, making sure they understood the timelines, making sure they understood what the precinct would feel like and look like with COVID in the picture. So did a wonderful job with that. But if you look at going back to the different states, and again, this is no surprise to any of you, but the national conversation when you have issues that come up, and several of them we'll kind of mention here. The second look commission there, where the validity of adjudicated ballots outside the law. You look at ballots cured after the fact. You look at absentee applications sent without requests. You look at extended polling hours in several locations, drop boxes without legislative approval, election dates that were possibly moved, improprieties. So you look at mail ballots that went out to everyone, whether or not they requested them. They were assumed valid, even if they didn't have a signature or address. Mail-ins that were submitted without envelopes, arrival date 3 days after the election, accepted without IDs in certain places, trafficking ballots, obviously more than that were allowed, accepting voters in the wrong precincts, absentees accepted without the creases in their ballots. So you look at different issues that have kind of been brought up around the country. And one of the things that I hope we will do is not just focus on the rhetoric, the threats that were made. That is very, very important. And I do not take any significance from that whatsoever. I think we've got to focus on that. And there's no reason for that to happen in a civilized society. We should work across aisles together. We should work with each other, build relationships. And again, as I've mentioned to you before, one of the most important things that we did was committing to go to all 82 counties and visiting with our clerks and commissioners, listening to them. What are the issues that you're seeing? Having those open lines of communication have really helped here in Mississippi, be it COVID, what the precinct should look like. Clerks and commissioners and election workers, what have you seen out there? What do we need to do to tweak our plans moving forward to make sure Mississippians feel safe to come vote? So very important. But again, it's also important to see what were the issues that were out there. Why is there so much consternation and so much anger in the electorate? Again, some folks have stirred that up, and I understand that piece. But were there issues that happened that should not have happened? Absolutely, I believe that. So I think it's important that we identify those issues, have adult conversations about those issues, but that is no excuse for death threats, for violence. There's no excuse for that. But again, you look at the issue there of what should we address to make sure that we're returning confidence to the system, but also not excusing threats and other violence that's not acceptable in the United States of America. And one of the things that we've done in Mississippi, people say this all the time, Michael, you talk about how good of the election was ran here in Mississippi in 2020, but now you talk about election integrity and continuing on that issue. We've got a piece of legislation right now across the street in the state capitol, and the legislature is winding down. Within the next few days, they will be hopefully signing dying and going back to their homes and out of the capitol. But House Bill 1510 is one that we're working on now, and I think we've got some good momentum. I met with the speaker today actually about that legislation to see where the House was, and hopefully we can get the Senate on board with the House's position. But it deals with three things: voter roll maintenance, and we've talked about that quite often, making sure that we're having clean voter rolls to the extent that you don't want to allow for the opportunity for folks to take advantage of folks who are dead or on the rolls, or folks who no longer live here, or folks that should not be on the rolls. So that's the first piece of the legislation, dealing with voter roll maintenance, making sure that we're codifying the laws and the system that we've been following here in Mississippi for quite some time, the national narrative of looking at HR1, HR4, and S1, federalizing the elections process and the system there. I know the Constitution left that to the states to determine the elections. So we want to make sure that we're following the law here, but codifying that gives Mississippi a leg to stand on should a federal action take place that we don't think is right for Mississippi here. So that's number one. Number two is making sure that only United States citizens are voting in our elections. We've seen that issue across the country. It's matriculated around from California to Vermont to Illinois in some places to New York. I think that's an important piece. So that's the second piece of our legislation. And then the third piece is the election support fund. And that's an important one as well. If you look at Mississippi, when we have an out-of-state LLC, when they file their annual reports, they pay $250 into the election support fund when they file their reports. So that money is for filing your report, but then the money goes into this election support fund, which my predecessor rightfully set up when he was in office. But those dollars currently, 50% of that fund goes to our counties, and that's very important. The other 50% goes to the general fund, and that's not elections. So election support fund, since it's named that, we think that should go all to elections. So the third piece of that legislation changes that format to 70% will go to the counties, 30% will go to our office. And people say, well, Michael, let's talk about why we need that. One of the biggest issues we've seen here is election equipment. And as you well know, the state purchased equipment back in 03, 04, and that equipment is coming to the end of its lifespan. So we've got to update our equipment here in Mississippi. Many counties have already done that. Several counties that need to do that can't because they can't afford it. So these dollars, hopefully the legislature will appropriate money for the counties to get that equipment, but these dollars will then help to program for the ballots and other issues needing election support. The 30% will come to our office, and you talk about cybersecurity, which is a big issue as well, dealing with misinformation, dealing with attacks on our system. So we need that funding to make sure that, again, we can return confidence to what we're doing here in our state. I think there's a good sense of confidence in Mississippi elections. I think that nationally is probably a bigger issue in their minds, but when they look at Mississippi as a whole, I think we've got a really good system here, and I think Mississippians have confidence in that. But again, everything that we can do, every piece that we can add to make sure that we're returning their confidence, making sure they understand we're doing all that we can to protect their vote. I think it's very important. So lastly, and again, we'll have some question and answer period here, but I just think it's important to know we're an active office. We're out in the communities, engaging, making sure that people understand the process. We're meeting with our clerks and commissioners. We're up to about 44, 45 counties now, the 82 that we've been to. So obviously COVID slammed the brakes on that, and we've started that back within the last couple of months, but a really important thing that we're doing there. And lastly, I would say, and you're no stranger to this, but we do see misinformation from time to time and disinformation, bad actors, Russia, China, Iran, other countries, but also here in the States. And I think it's not just a left issue. It's not just a right issue. It's an issue that all of us should be concerned with and aware of. And again, I think some of the misinformation is also something that may cause some of the violence. People just spitting out things that aren't true to enrage, to outrage folks. I think that's an important piece we should be looking for. So NASH, the National Association of Secretaries of State, started an effort called Trusted Info. And it's one thing that we've tried to get out from our office and social media, as well as talking to our clerks and commissioners, but making sure that Mississippians know who to contact. Talk to your circuit clerks, talk to your elections commissioners, talk to our office. When you see things on Twitter, when you see things on Facebook, when you see things in the news, if you've got questions about those, we hope that you'll lean out and reach out to a trusted source, being our office, our clerk's offices, our commissioner's offices, local elected officials, so they can understand, hey, look, was that true or not? And I just want to make sure I've got proper information before I spread it. So that's very important, making sure that we're dodging the misinformation, getting out true facts, not repeating lies or misinformation, disinformation used to subvert the process. So those are a few things that we're working on. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions and talk through specific issues if you would like. So that's just an update from us. It is an issue that we're focused on, the violence and the threats. There's no place for that in our country. So we've got to do a better job with that. But again, let's look at what is the root cause. Why are we seeing these things, and making sure that we're addressing those in elections processes across our country. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And I look forward to visiting with you.
Thank you, Secretary. Specific to the question of attacks on officials, there was a poll recently taken by the Brennan Center where they polled approximately 600 election officials around the country. And it's really chilling, some of the things that they reported, everything from racial harassment to death threats coming to their home, and receiving death threats in person on their phone. Two of the things that I'd like to ask you about specifically is the biggest reason the officials give for this behavior is the people who come to them with these threats are acting on false information, either outright lies or conspiracy theories. If you could comment on that, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, I certainly do think that is a part of it. Absolutely, I do. And again, you got to think about where's this coming from. Obviously, we have bad actors outside of the country trying to sow seeds of discourse and undercut, democracy here in our country. So that is part of it. I also think you've got some bad, probably political actors. It's unfortunately very partisan, a big partisan divide in our country right now. And sadly, sometimes it's easier to make attacks than it is to sit down with somebody and build a relationship and talk through issues. So I think that is part of it. But you can't, in my mind, I don't think you can just throw out, well, wait a minute, did some things happen that probably should not have happened? And you look at states like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Arizona where there were questions. And again, these are allegations. So I'm not here to try to be the trier of fact. I'm not here to be the judge or the jury. But you look at these things, and did some things happen that were possibly outside of the law? And I think that's another issue that we've got to figure out. Are the facts there? Do they prove that? And if they do prove that, do folks rightfully have a question? Again, that is not to say, and it does not support whatsoever, the escalation to violence or threats. There's no place for that, period. I don't care what happened. There's no place for that. We should have conversation. We should point out those issues and correct them at the legislative level, which is why I think elections, again, were at the state level, and the Constitution, the 10th Amendment left that to the states. So it should be legislative. It should be fixes like that. But when you step outside the bounds of the law, when you settle lawsuits outside of your statutory ability and authority, we got sued here in Mississippi. One of the things that we did with the settlement that we, obviously you're aware of that, but some of the things that we did with our settlement here was making sure, again, do I have the authority to agree to whatever the settlement might be? Making sure that I was within the bounds of the law. I think you saw that in some other states where possibly they went outside the bounds of the law, which makes people mad. That's not the process. That's not how it should work. We should do things right and correct here in our country. So I do think, again, misinformation plays a big role in that. Disinformation plays a big role in that. I do think there are some fact patterns out there that folks got concerned about. Again, I'm not making any excuses and do not condone whatsoever violence or attacks. But we need to look at all of that. And I think all of that together holistically will lead us to an answer, hopefully in the future.
Okay, Secretary, I have a comment here from one of our participants, Deirdre Payne, and she quotes the Brennan Center for the poll that I mentioned, called Election Officials Under Attack. This is the quote: "The most troubling and impactful villainization of election officials in the last year has come from some of America's political leaders. Many have pointed to President Trump's attempt to delegitimize the 2020 election as rigged and the Stop the Steal movement that he has inspired as the reason for targeting election officials. But the problem goes farther and deeper than that. In several states, party leaders have censured and replaced officials who insist on telling the truth about security and accuracy of elections. Legislators have introduced bills that would impose criminal penalties on election officials and workers for taking steps like proactively sending mail ballot applications to voters or under certain circumstances." I won't go any further. There's a lot more, but what about the idea that there are still people who don't accept the results of the federal 2020 election, and that can be a source of attacks on a lot of local officials?
I don't think that discussion is going to go away anytime soon. Again, when you talk about the partisan nature, unfortunately, and the partisan divide that's in our country right now, it's an easy conversation to bring up. It strikes a lot of folks' emotions that do still have concerns about the 2020 election. So I think that that's going to be around for quite some time. Now, again, I think the key is, if you're on RR day, it doesn't matter. The key is, what were the facts? Did we go outside the bounds of the law to run this election? If we did, why? And I think the public deserves an explanation for those issues. If they didn't, then you know, hey, let's make sure that we can prove that to show folks the process. And again, I go back to what we have done, is getting out of the communities, talking through elections process in Mississippi. What does it look like from registration to election day? Making sure people understand, here are the laws, we followed the law, and here was the result. So I think that's a big piece of making sure that secretaries are out there, you know, talking through community leaders and talking to folks around the state, making sure they understand, hey, here's the process. So you're always going to have that politically charged crowd. That's just going to happen, no matter if it's an RRD. That's just an easy, you know, area that you're going to see some conflict. But we've got to be real and understand, did some things happen that shouldn't have happened? Maybe so. In Mississippi, I don't think that was the case. So I can only speak to what I know here in our state. But that is a problem, and I think that's one that's going to continue until, you know, we continue to work on election integrity, point out the issues that we saw. What did we do to correct those? And once we corrected those, I think you're going to see a return back to, well, you know what, that argument is gone. It no longer exists, because if there was a loophole, if there was something outside of the law, and I'm not saying, there were some instances where I would think it maybe specifically wasn't illegal, but maybe there was some attempts to you know, abuse the system, abuse the process. So even though it wasn't illegal, let's talk through them. You know, did something happen that was possibly legal, but maybe we took advantage of the situation? And I think, again, the electorate is smart. Just Americans are smart people. And so let's have adult conversations, talk through these issues. You know, if there was an issue, how do we address it? Make sure we know that it's addressed by law, the way that the Constitution and state law works, and making sure we're returning confidence to the process. I think you're muted.
You're on mute.
There we go.
You muted yourself.
Okay.
Did it again.
Hey, Joanne, you're muted.
Is somebody muting me? Because I unmuted me twice.
You're good now.
Okay.
Okay, thank
I'm
you.
not muting you, I promise.
Thank you. Again, from Leslie Lynn, you indicate that there are not many issues with voter fraud or improprieties in Mississippi elections, and that has led to strong elections here. In your mind, is this a public relations problem? Do you have a campaign budget to counter that misconception? What are your plans?
I don't. You know, that's one of the things that we have done as well.
You don't have plans, or you don't have a budget?
Ma'am?
You don't have plans, or you don't have a budget?
Oh, we don't have a budget. We do have plans. You know, and that's the part. One of the things that we really try to focus on with election law is, again, or educating folks on the process. I do not have prosecutorial authority when you have election fraud or issues with election law. We have to revert to our district attorneys to make sure that they are aware of the problem, or the Attorney General's office to get them to prosecute the cases. Now, there are multiple cases in Mississippi. There are several that we're working on right now. So election fraud is real. It happens. Do I think it's widespread in Mississippi? Absolutely not. But one vote counts. Every single vote in this state counts. So if it's an election issue at a local level that could impact a circuit clerk's race or a city council member's race, that matters. We've seen tied elections in the history of Mississippi multiple times. We've seen elections by 1 or 2 votes where the winner won by a couple of votes multiple times. So every vote matters, every vote counts. So making sure that we're prosecuting those to the fullest extent of the law is very important to us. Talking through that process, making sure people know that we are doing that, I think does return confidence to the system. Now, you're right. I think we don't have the money to get out there on talk shows, on road commercials, on radio, and you name it. But every chance we get in the community to talk through that process, we're doing that. So every vote matters, every individual matters. So the more people we can talk to, the better that's going to get.
Secretary Watson, what do you mean by election fraud? I mean, there seems to be an attempt to connect fraud with some of the attempts like the so-called audits and the replacement of officials, when election fraud, as a matter of on the ground, of voters presenting them or people presenting themselves as voters and they're not, or stealing physical votes. Study after study after study has been done that says it just doesn't exist. It's not the problem that often people make it out to be. And it doesn't require these big scale responses that some proponents are demanding. Can you make a comment about that?
Yeah, I couldn't disagree more. Election fraud is real and it happens. And again, I think one of the things that you would see with those arguments would be at a national scale. Does it happen at a national scale, and does it impact national elections? Maybe that's the angle they're trying to take. Now, I've seen several of those studies, but I would say here in Mississippi, and I'll give you a prime example. We've got an issue in one of our counties, and I won't say which, but there was an issue with absentee request forms, and this individual was basically taking advantage of nursing homes. And we found where some of the forms requesting the ballots or requesting someone to help them with their votes had been whited out and the dates had been replaced. Well, we went back and looked, and the individuals had passed away a couple of years ago. That's election fraud. That happened in Mississippi. We've seen where folks are notarizing ballots where the person was not in front of them, but they notarized it anyway, absentee ballots. So we've seen cases of that around the state. So it happens. And again, if you take it from the national level, well, did that individual that happened in one county in Mississippi impact the presidential election? Absolutely not. But could it have impacted the city council election? Oh, absolutely. We've seen legislative races that were tied. We saw one just several years ago where they had to draw straws to see who the winner was because it tied. So it happens. So you can't take the macro focus on, hey, does it impact a federal election? Maybe not. But if you look at the micro impact, can it happen to a local election? Absolutely. A city council member? Absolutely. And it does happen. So every case matters. And don't forget now, one of the things that we found, one of the instances that we found, you didn't find it in the election. An individual was actually testifying in a case on something and basically told on herself. And that's how we found the issue. So sometimes you don't see it in the election itself. It's hard to find, but when you do find it, we've got to be honest about it. We've got to prosecute it to the fullest extent. So the next person says, wait a minute, I don't need to do that because I'm going to get caught and get busted. To the audit point, and I think this is very important. I think you're going to see the legislature talk about that next year. We had some legislation this year dealing with the audit process. And what you saw in Arizona, I want to remind people, because we get asked often here in Mississippi, well, why are you not auditing? Arizona did that through the legislature, through their subpoena power. It was not done through the state, through the Secretary of State's office. I think it's important to note audits are a good thing. No, you need to know the rules on the front end and make sure that you're clear so you don't change the rules based on you don't like an outcome of election. So I'm going to change a rule to where this audit is going to apply, as opposed to I like the outcome of that election, so I won't apply that audit. You got to have clear rules on the front end. And I want to remind folks, and this is something that always comes up, you may recall, you saw some of the conversation in the legislature this year where basically it was said, I can't remember the direct quote, but those crazy wackos out on the right, want audits now. But let me remind you, in 2017, John Podesta, who was the chief of staff of President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and their group came out with a report and said, well, how do we make sure that our elections are right and we can trust that? One of the things that they supported, audits. So the left side supported audits, the right side supported audits, but they don't like them unless it's going to be helpful to them. So we got to get somewhere where we have this adult conversation. Well, are they good or are they not? You can't support it when your person loses and then don't support it when your person wins. That's something we got to address. So I think you'll see that next year, audit process here in Mississippi, and a long conversation with the legislature.
Secretary, the principle of audit, I don't think anybody would say that a truly professional audit conducted by professionals under professional rules is the problem. But what happened in Arizona was not a professional auditing organization. They were more of a lobbying political group that were looking for things like false votes caused by communications with Italian satellites, or they were looking for votes from China and looking for a certain amount of bamboo in the paper votes. I don't think that's the kind of audit we would support. So I think what we have to do is separate the principle of a good audit from a false audit.
Agreed, which is why I said, let's have clear rules on the front end that apply across the board, no matter what the outcome is. And again, having someone that's legitimate from the Secretary of State's office, or if we bring in an official audit firm, whatever it's going to be, but people need to trust that process. And that's what I was saying. You get it political, and that's unfortunate. Well, the left supports it here when they lost, the right supports it here when they lost. Wait a minute, they're either good or they're not. And I get what you're saying there to the Arizona audit, and people need to be very clear on this. We're talking about an audit process that's run by law through the process here in statutory oversight in Mississippi with the Secretary of State's office involved. So I think it's important to delineate between the two of those. It's a different process.
Okay, I'm going to read another comment. This is from B. Glover of PPS National. Quote, "The root cause is that conspiracy theories are coming from deep pockets filled with dark money, and the encouragement and literal acts of violence are partisan." That's the quote.
I'm reading it with you there.
Oh, good. I left my stage voice at home.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about deep pockets, and again, we go back to, and this is something that the country as a whole has discussed, be it CISA, be it DHS, be it FBI, you name it. There's bad actors from other countries, China and Iran and Russia, and they want to sow discord in our country. So that's a lot of times where we're seeing this coming from. Not to mention some bad actors in our country itself that don't like the outcome of elections, or you name it. People do things for different reasons. So we got to be careful with that. My hope is that we can kind of hit a cooling off period and understand exactly what happened. But if neither side is going to be able to kind of stand down in a sense and talk through the issues, you know, if it's a Republican, that Democrats are saying, hey, Republicans are the one making all these threats. But Republicans are saying, hey, Democrats, y'all are the ones that broke the law or subverted the will of the people, or whatever you did. Okay. Let's identify those issues on both sides and have a little conversation. You can't just say, well, you're wrong and I'm right. Well, no, you're wrong and I'm right. Wait a minute. You know, I'm an attorney. Typically, you're going to have your side of the story. I'm going to have my side of the story. Well, can we sit down and figure out what is it that we agree on, that we can work together on and move forward on? So I get it. That's a tough part. I saw one up here as well. They were asking the status of the initiative process in Mississippi. Just to touch on that really quickly, that piece of legislation is still alive, as I understand it, in the legislature. What they did now, they addressed, it's not going to be the initiative process that you were aware of, the constitutional amendment process. They've taken that away. What they have focused on is a statutory amendment process. So when we came in, after we saw the medical marijuana debate and obviously the argument at the Supreme Court here, what we advised, and basically our position was, look, we need to keep the constitutional amendment process. Now, I think that the statutory amendment process may be a good idea. Most states actually have both of them. So we can look at having both of them. I don't think we should take the constitutional process away. The legislature saw differently, and the last piece of the draft that I saw only had the statutory process and not the constitutional process. So I don't know if it's going to pass, but just to answer your question, that's the status of it in the legislature right now.
Okay, Ruth Odell is asking, how will the elected officials in our state and local communities be protected during the midterm elections? And I'm going to give you the second question from Evelyn Smith. If this was the most fair and safe election, why is election integrity the issue? So whichever one you want to take first.
Sure. Good question on how elected officials in our state and local communities will be protected. You know, I've not received any threats. Quite honest about that, and really honestly haven't heard of many around Mississippi. I've heard more out of the state in different parts of the country, not here in Mississippi. So Mississippi, for the most part, has been very civil, and they appreciate the folks who run the elections. Again, I think one of the differences is being a bottom-up state. And you know your circuit clerk in your home county, you know your elections commissioners in your home county. So that level of community and that level of conversation, seeing them at the grocery store or at church or Walmart, wherever you see them, lends a little more credibility to the process here in our state. And I'm not aware of a bunch of threats and really any threats, to be honest with you, that I've heard here in Mississippi. So I'm not so concerned about us here in our state. It's other states that you're going to see that concern. The next question was, if this was the most fair and safe election, why is election integrity the issue? It will always be the issue. Every single vote matters. So you got to stay ahead of the curve, in my opinion. Continuing to see, how do we make sure that people trust the process? So if there's issues out there that we can address in the legislature, then we need to do that. I don't think we should just sit back and not do anything. And let me tell you this, there will never be a perfect election. They just don't exist. So one of the things that we try to do, again, is educating the public on this. How does the process work? What does it look like? But when we see things from time to time that we can improve on, we're going to do it. Even if we had the best election ever, that very next year, I'm going to try to figure out, how do we get it better? How do we make this better? How's the process better in Mississippi? So I'm never going to be one that rests on any kind of progress that we make until I make sure, look, there's nothing else we can do to make it any safer. We've done everything we can do. So you'll continue to see me focus on election integrity as long as I'm the Secretary of State.
Okay, that leads to the next question. How can a person get a voter ID in Mississippi? What is your office doing to make the process clear and as simple as possible for people to follow?
So we've got, again, outreach, making sure that people know the process. But there are a number of ways that you can register to vote in Mississippi. Obviously, your circuit clerk's office, your municipal clerk's office, the DMV, the local driver's license bureau in your community. If you go to DHS, if you go to Medicaid, any of these offices that are out there, federal offices like that with benefits, you can register there as well. So there are a number of places to do that. Y'allvote.ms is a website that we run, and there's a lot of information on there for folks to go and see, how do I get registered to vote? Where can I register to vote? Schedule of the elections, a ton of information is on that site. So we're doing a lot more with that, promoting that, making sure people understand, how do I register to vote? When do I go register to vote? What are the deadlines? What are the timelines? When is the next election? So making sure people are aware of that is something that we're focused on and we'll continue to talk about. So y'allvote.ms is our site for that, and I encourage you to go check it out.
Thank you. From Amy Rita, were there any improprieties in the Mississippi election in 2020?
I think there were. Again, when I talk about active cases right now, obviously I can't divulge some of that information because we're working with the DA's office or the Attorney General's office. Do I think it was widespread? No, I don't. Not in Mississippi. And again, I can only speak to Mississippi because that's what I know and what happened here. Sometimes, and as I mentioned before, you don't always see it on election day. You don't always see it. You don't always catch it in time to do something about it. Sometimes things come out later. So did things happen? Sure, they did. And did things happen in 21 in the municipal elections? Absolutely, they did. And there's some cases that we're working on there. So again, I don't think it's a big widespread issue. I do think that some things happen. One of the things that we saw, and there's an active case right now dealing with folks who were encouraging folks to participate in elections and possibly having monetary rewards. We saw some of that around the north part of the state. So the issues are out there. We're addressing them as quickly as we can and being honest about them, having conversations about them, and we'll continue to do that until we're not Secretary of State anymore.
Okay, here's an interesting question. Do you believe that every voter should be able to vote within 2 to 5 miles of their residence?
That's a great question. Sorry, I was reading some of those comments. That's a great question. And in Mississippi, that decision is made with your local level officials. So your supervisors determine where your precincts are located. That's a hard one. That's going to be a lot of money, and a lot of the rural areas of Mississippi can we afford to operate all those precincts, to hire election workers? There's a lot of questions that go into that. Clearly, we want it to be as easy as possible for every legal resident of Mississippian who is of age and obviously fits the legal description of a legal voter here can vote. So that's a hard question, but again, that's one you're going to have supervisors discuss as well, depending on where they want to locate the precincts and how many precincts can they afford them. So that's a tough one that involves a lot of people, not just our office.
Let me put an addition to that. Doesn't the state have the obligation to make it physically possible for voters to vote, no matter where they live? If the state is by nature a rural state, doesn't the state government have the obligation to make it possible to vote?
Again, I'm not aware of that being the case in Mississippi. Where is there a case where somebody can't vote? I'm not aware of it. You look at the 2020 election and the turnout would indicate folks were obviously able to vote, and record number of them turned out.
Okay, I have another question for you. Secretary Watson, I've seen you urging people to check their registration often. What about those with a lack of computer access?
Yeah, libraries, there are ways to do that. And one of the, I think actually somebody made a comment about me saying, some of the responsibility that we have. And I think it's important to note, again, do mistakes happen? Absolutely. And I think that's important for us to, hopefully none of them happen. But if they do happen, we can check our registration status to make sure that we're updated. All the information is accurate. If we've moved, making sure that we update the information. So I think it's important for all of us to play an active role in the process. And part of that is, hey, let's check our information to make sure it's accurate. Know where we go to vote. Know who's up for election. Know, do I need to update the information? So I think that's an important role that all of us can play just to help the process. Again, hopefully no errors are made. But if they are, and we're checking this process, we can catch those errors much quicker if we're an active voter and actively checking our registration status.
Okay, along
You
the
have
same,
to? No, but I just think that's an important piece.
well, along the same lines from Sue Fino. She says, in looking for information in the news regarding voting in Mississippi, we came across a March 26, 2021 comment that Secretary of State Watson made on WLOX. Would the Secretary care to comment? Who do you want to vote? And if I am correct about this, I think what Sue is talking about is a comment where you said every Mississippian needs to check that they're on the voter list, that they haven't been purged, that they should check often that they're still on the list.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, look, if you're a legal resident of Mississippi and you meet all the qualifications to be a qualified elector, I want you to go vote. So through the process, and what we've tried to say is, I want all of us being an engaged electorate, checking our status, making sure that we understand when elections are, being engaged in the process. That's important. So I don't know how to answer that other than saying everyone that's legally eligible to vote in Mississippi, I want them to vote. I want them to be registered. And that's what we've done with our outreach programs. You saw us on Voter Registration Day, National Voter Registration Day, partnering with a bunch of our colleges around Jackson. We've been to Ole Miss, we've been in Mississippi State, we've been to Jackson State, we've been to a number of colleges doing voter registration drives. So we want everyone to be active in that as many as we can. And that's part of being an active participant in elections, getting out in our communities and making sure folks are educated on the process.
But why,
I have another, sorry, it was another comment that Secretary of State Watson made on that March 26, 2001 video. I can play it.
no, just repeat it. It's fine, Sue.
Okay. Well, he says that that our country will pay if woke college students are able to vote. And I was distressed by this because it sounded like he was not in favor of woke college students voting.
Secretary Watson, would you care to comment?
Yeah, so that comment, clearly my goal in talking through that, we were talking about, if I remember correctly, universal vote by mail. And a lot of times what we saw was if you're on the registered voter list, you get a ballot in your mailbox. And one of the things that we talked about, and we always talk about, and we'll continue to talk about, I think all of us want this is an educated electorate, folks who are paying attention, who understand, hey, look, I think it's better for our country if folks are engaged in the process. And that's where that comment was going. Now, obviously, it was spun and taken out of context, and that's fine. That's what happens. I want, again, as I mentioned before, if you're a legal and eligible voter in Mississippi, then I want you to go vote. I think it's better for our country when we have an engaged electorate who's paying attention, who understands the consequences of the votes they cast. That doesn't mean I want everyone to be an RRD or whatever you want to be. That's your decision. That's your choice. But I do want folks to be educated and know exactly what they're voting for and who they're casting their ballot for, what they stand for. Do they align with that individual? And I think that's important. I think all of us want that. All of us want an engaged electorate. And so that's what that comment was targeting.
Okay, and I just want to direct everybody's attention to the chat. Kendra James has put in a URL for voter ID information in Mississippi. So if you go into the chat, look for Kendra James and you'll have the link that you need. Amy Reeder asked the question, how would you purge the election rolls? What criteria will be used to purge a voter from the rolls?
Well, that's in law, so it's not a question of how I would do it. That's one of the things that we've talked about. We can. Do we share, Kendra? Do we share the y'allvote.ms?
I'm
We'll share
sorry,
that in the chat as well.
what was your question?
Y'allvote.ms, the website, so folks can go look at that as well.
I'll share.
Yeah, but we follow the current process in Mississippi that's based on the National Voter Registration Act. So it's actually federal law that's been in place in 1993. So it's not something that we make up. We just follow the law.
Do registered, this is from Sue again, do registered voters in Mississippi who get purged get a card saying they were purged and why? In other words, are they notified if they are purged?
No, ma'am, they are not. And why? That's not the law. That's not required. There is the way the process works now. And I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the camera. I'm looking at the screen over there. But the way the process now is you get a confirmation card to start that process. And that's basically the notification piece. So what we have talked about is how do we do that? And we've looked at some other states that have looked at this, Ohio and Secretary LaRose. One of the things that they do is they get information out to different groups and letting them see the list of folks who are about to be purged. So if they see someone on there, they can alert them to that process that what's going on. So that's something that we've talked about. Kyle is on here as well. Kyle and I have had that discussion a number of times. How can we get that process, make it a little bit easier for folks to know, hey, this is a purge process that's going on, give notification to people. So that's something we're looking at and working on. Again, it's not required by law. It's just something that we think maybe we want to try to get to accomplish here in Mississippi.
Okay, and I just want people to realize there were 24 new messages that have just been added. And obviously we're not going to get to everything before the end of our session. So anybody who has a question, if you want to send it to me, I'll send it on to Kendra and then perhaps it can be answered. Here's a comment. Let's see. Oh, and also different people are putting different links here. Here's a link from Deirdre that says attempts were made in Mississippi to suppress voter turnout. And she leads, has a link to a story on that. So if people are interested in that, you should go into the chat and get those.
I disagree with that. I see her link there. But again, that was not an attempt to suppress voter turnout. But hey, she's got her opinion, and that's okay.
Did you want to respond to it as to why it wasn't?
So I can't remember that specific article, but there was some confusion over the lines and where a precinct, if it was moved or not. And some folks asked us, they're supposed to let us know when a precinct changes so we can help get that word out. And we had not been made aware of that one. But again, the purpose was not to suppress voting. So I just completely disagree with that.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, and Ruth just said she will be able to save all the questions in the chat. We can send it on to Kendra. Let's see.
Yeah, we're happy
Joanne,
to answer any questions that y'all want to send.
Joanne, do you mind touching on the question about the precincts and how some were saying that they were moved right before Election Day? I think that's a question we do receive a lot in our office, and I would love for the secretary to be able to clear that up on this call.
Who's, sure, if whoever was saying that, if you could just raise the question, we'll save some time. Go ahead.
Yeah, again, I'll speak specifically to the precinct piece. That's a
Okay.
decision made at the local level. And I think that's an important part that we kind of touched on before, Mississippi being a bottom-up state. Many of those decisions, even down to what kind of machines you use, that's a decision made at the local level. The supervisors make that decision. Where precincts are located, which ones are closed and which ones are moved. Those are decisions that are all made at the local level. So again, they're supposed to report those to us and we get that word out as quickly as we can. But sometimes, unfortunately, that doesn't happen. But that is an issue at the local level. And it's important to note, again, that the differentiation there between some states where it's a top-down approach and other states where, like Mississippi, where it's a bottom-up approach. So that process and making people understand how it works here in Mississippi is important. So they know who to call, who are your trusted sources of information, as I mentioned before. When those decisions happen at the local level, that's going to be your supervisors, your circuit clerks, and your elections commissioners. Those are the folks who you want to ask those questions of.
Okay, and Deirdre again is giving us a quote from the Brennan article with the study, quote, "Finally, and most troubling for the future of our democracy, state legislatures across the nation have taken steps to strip election officials of the power to run, count, and certify elections, consolidating power in their own hands over processes intended to be free of partisan or political interference." And one place we saw that dramatically was in Georgia. Georgia passed after Raffensperger refused to change some of the results of the election. The state legislature passed a law saying from now on, it will be the legislature who will determine any contested issues regarding future elections. And that is what Deidre is asking for a comment on.
Well, number one, I think that the legislators are the ones who should be making the rules on elections. I think that should be done at the state level. As a former legislator, one of the things I love the most is I was answerable to the people, as opposed to some other folks who may have been appointed to some positions in elections weren't specifically answerable to the people. Now, if you disagree with those, I get it, I understand. But you've got a process where that individual is going to go before you for an election, and you can question them on those issues and vote them out of the office if you disagree with them. So I think that's where the law should be made. Do I agree with everything that's been done across this country? I don't know everything that's been done in every state across this country, so I can't address those specifically. What I can talk about is Mississippi, and I'm proud of the system that we have. We want to make it better. Obviously, that should always be our goal with everything. How do we make things better? So we're going to continue to work on that. But again, I can't speak specifically to that question there in Georgia, but I do appreciate and support the idea that legislators are the ones making those rules and regulations for elections in their separate states. What works in Minnesota may not work in Georgia. What works in Florida may not work in Oregon, and I get it. That's fine. But those local elected officials, those local elected legislators have to answer to the people in those states. I think that's an important process. And that's why I do think our framers set that up, the process for states to handle their own elections.
I think the concern there is that an election official is supposed to be an independent actor. And by making the legislature of any state the arbiter of an election question, automatically is going to put it into a political process rather than an independent one. And I think that's the concern that's being.
I certainly get that concern, and elections should be something that is nonpartisan, something that's up the middle. That if you look at our package right now, I think, and I've talked to many of our legislators about it. This is just, in my mind, common sense up the middle. Piece of legislation that is in my mind is not partisan. It just things that make sense for our election process here in Mississippi. So that's how it should be. Encouraging everyone to go vote. Again, I talk about our college partnerships that we made, the colleges that we visited here in Jackson and around the state. I think it's important to go to every college that we have, and we're working on that. We've been to a ton of them here. We were at Tugelo, we were at Jackson State, and several others here in Belhaven, Mississippi College. I can't remember all of the ones that we went to here in Mississippi, but that's an important piece. Making sure that everybody's aware of the process and getting them to register to vote.
Okay, and I think this is going to be our last comment. We are coming up on the end of our time. The last comment will be from B. Glover tonight. Leading up to the last national election, Mississippi officials moved 3 times more polling places than were originally reported, ultimately impacting 65,000 Mississippi voters. Most of the information reached voters via news reports that came out less than a week from Election Day. Why were so many polling places moved, and how will your office ensure that this does not happen again, or that Mississippi voters are notified earlier? And B. Glover includes a link to documentation for that comment.
Yeah, I noticed the source there. So again, that's a local decision. Supervisors, your circuit clerks, and your commissioners kind of collaborate with those issues. Supervisors obviously make that decision, but that's not something that we can say you can't do that. They have that right by law. What we can do is encourage them, hey, give us as much heads up as you can so we can make people aware of this. And that's very important. So that's a process that we play. But again, that decision is made at the local level. We can't stop them from doing that. That's the law as it's written in Mississippi. Another process or another instance of, hey, look, if that's something that we disagree with, we've got the ability to go to our legislators and say, hey, that's something that we want changed. That's the beauty of states having the ability to craft their own election laws and being answerable to the people.
Okay, and just a final word from Kendra. She sends us a link that you can look at where the secretary is going to discuss these issues with local elections. He has an 82 county tour coming up, and perhaps one will be in Lafayette County for those of you who want to.
We're about 45 in on that. I've actually been to Lafayette. I met with the circuit clerk in his office. And the elections commissioners had a wonderful visit, a great lunch in Ajax, and then obviously a good visit to Ole Miss, my alma mater. I did want to talk really quickly in closing here, who's responsible for training the clerks and county elections commissioners. It's one of the things that we do is we do train our commissioners and our clerks. Their associations have annual visits where they go down to the coast, one and then one's in Jackson, their conferences. We do attend those conferences and help them with the training components. One of the things that I've tried to do, one of the things that Kyle and I are working on is how do we make that training even more advanced? I think it's important to make sure that our election officials are trained properly. So we're also doing reminders that we're going to do videos where they can look at prior to election day. Hey, let's make sure that I'm following the law here. Let me go click on this video, a real quick 2-minute explanation of what I should be looking at or what I should be looking for. So different video links like that they can be just kind of refreshers before election day, but also the training process itself. We just set up a new training mechanism here that we're going to be rolling out where we can go travel around. Matter of fact, we just finished procuring some laptops so we can go into different counties and different areas to do more training, hands-on training, so people can see the process, not just talk about it, but also see it and then practice it on the computers themselves. So we're really focused on training. I think that's a very important piece, and I appreciate you asking that question.
Okay, thank you. Well, it is now a couple of minutes past our last time. I want to thank Kendra for her assistance with the logistics. I know scheduling Secretary of State is not the easiest thing to do, but mostly I'd like to thank, well, all of the League of Women Voters here in Northern Mississippi and Oxford. Want to thank the Secretary for attending our session tonight. We think these are very important topics, and one thing we do agree is the discussion has to happen, and thank you for participating.
You're very welcome. Thank y'all for having me. And again, I was just typing a comment here. Appreciate your time, and we won't always agree, and that's part of what makes the fabric of our country and our state beautiful. We can have those conversations without being disagreeable. So I really appreciate the civil nature of the conversation. I will happily come back and visit with you on other topics. But again, I think that's an important piece, that we're going to respect each other, even though we're going to disagree from time to time. That's okay. I don't agree with my wife all the time, but I still respect her. She's smarter than I am, so I'll give her that credit. But again, I think it's important that we have these conversations. So I really appreciate the civil nature here and the ability to talk to you one-on-one or not one-on-one, but whatever this is, virtually. So look forward to catching all of you around the state at some point in time.
Well, thank
This
you
is the
very much for
21st
being,
I was just going to say, this is the 21st century town hall meeting, Secretary.
okay, good. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. We do appreciate elected officials, Secretary of State Watson, who will come and talk with us and be open and leave themselves open to questions. We do appreciate that and thank you for it. You can tell we're all passionate about voting. That's where the League of Women Voters. And we've been around for a long time working for everyone to have access to the vote. And we're going to keep doing that. And the more we can work with you to do that and be sure that happens in this state, even if we're giving you information or asking questions that might be uncomfortable, we feel like that's our role to do. So we do appreciate, though, you coming here tonight. Everybody, we have one more of these programs, and that's going to be next week. Our topic is a manipulation of the electoral college. We want to get a little more understanding about that whole piece of the voting process at the federal level. Joanne, who is our speaker next time?
You're muted again. You're muted again.
That is so
No,
against my nature to be muted. I don't understand.
Evelyn might could speak up.
Yeah,
Evelyn, I just didn't write it down.
It's from the.
Adam, the Senior Director for Voting and Elections for the League of Women Voters, U.S.
Right. Adam who?
Abrangi.
Abrangi, yeah. He's a
Yes.
new director of policy at the national level for the League of Women Voters. And I better learn his name soon because I'm going to be the moderator. So it'd be good if I really knew his name. No,
We
but I
might
hope it'll
fire
be
you if not.
Yeah, I hope we'll have another great turnout. We do appreciate your interest in this. And thank you again to all the participants. Good night and be safe
night.
at home.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.